Everybody turn on your mic, please.
Pretty sure you can hear.
If you noticed, all the stickets that Michael had, none of us was PP.
I only have a 3.
There's 32 stickets there. What are you
I
talking
thought
about?
if we were gonna go through everything.
What this is all about.
What's that?
You're just smart reading on your computer. So
I haven't.
Okay, I call to order the December 13th meeting of Planning and Zoning. May I have a roll call vote, please?
All looking to the right.
Amanda, I. Sage Pearson, I.
Jeff Armstead, present.
Lynn Teach, aye. Oh, present. Gotcha.
Michael present
Here.
here.
And we have Madison and Scott with us. Please rise. I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. Okay, has everybody read the minutes from the last meeting?
Yes.
Does anybody have any edits? No, may I have a vote to approve the minutes of the November 8th meeting?
Making motion to approve the minutes of November 8th meeting.
May I have a second?
Second.
All in favor?
Aye.
Approval of our regular agenda, which is tonight. Any amendments or deletions? Madison? No. Anybody on mission? No. May I have a motion to approve tonight's agenda?
I make a motion to approve tonight's agenda.
May I have a second?
Second.
Motion by Amanda, second by Jeff. All in favor?
Aye.
Does anybody have any conflicts of interest tonight? No.
No, ma'am.
Are there any citizens in the audience who would like to speak? No one online. There's no ghosts either. Minutes passed.
Maybe
Could be, and we just don't see them, right?
he'll be there.
We have no special presentations. We have design review and land use public hearings. No. Discussion direction items, Minturn forward code assessment. Scott?
Thank you, Madam Chair. Is Matt with us yet? Okay, great. So as promised, and as highly anticipated, we have a code assessment that was produced by Matt Fair. Matt put a lot of work, I think, into this. Hopefully you guys got a chance to go through it. My favorite part is the section of the code assessment that kind of looks toward the future of how our new code might be organized and consolidated. If you spend some time with that and kind of compare it to what we have now, really makes me excited because I think it could be a lot more user-friendly and a little bit easier to navigate. So Matt is with us tonight to walk you through kind of a high-level overview of what he did, which in itself is kind of a high-level overview. We didn't get into the weeds of specific sections of the code that we need to change. But as he described what he was going to do and now looking at what he actually did for this code assessment, it's supposed to just be a high-level assessment of things that jumped out to him. Again, one of the values of having Matt helping us on this is he's a very objective third-party view who, doesn't have a lot of experience using this particular code, but has done this for other jurisdictions. So I really appreciate his objective view of what our current code looks like and how it could be amended. So with that, Matt, are you out there? And again, thank you very much for your hard work on this.
Yeah, thank you, Scott. I am here. Can you guys hear me?
Any questions before Matt gets started?
I just want to say one thing.
Sure.
I'd like to remind everybody that this is the community plan is a recommending document, not an edict. So we can all voice our opinions and there'll be further talks about it in the future. Thank you. It's yours, Matt.
All right, so I do have a presentation. Give me just a second here.
As Matt's doing that, the pizzas were just a small gesture, just to say thank you. You guys put in a ton of work all year long. We appreciate it. I love serving this board, and so Merry Christmas. Matt, Michelle
Thank you.
heard us talking about
Thank
this
you,
at lunch,
Michelle.
and she handed the credit card to Madison so we could purchase. pizza.
All right, saloon.
Are there like bags of money in it?
Got it?
Like Oprah?
Madam Chair,
Your chair.
I think last time we had Matt in as a presenter, we reminded ourselves about, Matt being a consultant. Do we think we need to remind the group again, after his presentation? To let him go to save all that.
Oh, yes. And the other thing is, please try not to speak over each other during the meeting. It saves time.
Thank you.
Yeah, take as much time as you need to give your ideas out, but try not to speak over. Okay? Thank you.
All right, are we ready to roll?
Mhm.
Okay. So good evening, Scott. Thank you for that introduction. As Scott mentioned, this code assessment is intended to be a guide as we actually start getting into the heavy lifting of updating the town's land use code. And when I talk about, I guess in my mind, when I talk about the land use code, I think it's chapter 16, which is zoning, chapter 17, which is subdivision, and then there's appendix B, which is the town's design guidelines and standards. So I think in my mind, all three of those sections or elements of the town's municipal code really comprise all the different regulations that dictate development in Minturn. So as I said, the code assessment is really this guide that offers an overview of the priorities or key themes that came out of the community plan update, the town's strategic plan, as well as discussions with you all as the planning commission and the stakeholder meetings that we had back in September. And the themes are really kind of serve as the priorities or the guideposts for the code update. So as we get into the code update and get in kind of, there's definitely a possibility of getting lost in the weeds. I think it's always helpful to step back and say, okay, what are we actually trying to achieve here through the update of the town's land use regulations. And then those themes that were identified also provided the basis for the recommendations that are included in the code assessment. And again, a lot of those recommendations that were included in the code assessment are fairly high level. I tried to stay away from specifically saying on page such and such or in section such and such, this word needs to be changed from should to shall or anything like that. It's more high level recommendations for updating the code. And if at any point you have any questions, definitely feel free to interrupt me. I'd like this to be more of a discussion rather than me just talking at you all. In terms of key themes or priorities that emerged, the first one was to reorganize and reformat the code to improve usability. I think right now the code it's been updated over the years, and I've seen it in other communities where when that happens, you start to get this patchwork of regulations that there's redundancies or there's sections of the code that are inconsistent. There's regulations that are kind of hidden in different sections. So I think as we get into the code update, one of the key priorities will be figuring out how do we take what's in the code now, reorganize it, reformat it so that it's quote unquote more user friendly, so that you don't have to have 10 years of experience working with the code to know where different provisions are. And in the code assessment, in the appendices, I did include some suggestions for how to reorganize or sort of reorganize and consolidate the existing sections of the town's land use codes. That's a suggestion based on codes I've worked on in the past and just some of my own recommendations for how to reorganize and consolidate the code. That's definitely nothing that's set in stone. So that can be sort of a guide as we get into the code update to think about how the town may want to reorganize it and also consolidate the different sections of the land use code. Second is to develop a code that facilitates the implementation of Mintern's community plan and strategic plan. Again, this was definitely something that came out of our discussions with the Planning Commission and the stakeholders. And I think it's something that was discussed and fairly frequently throughout the update to the community plan, in that the community plan's kind of a high level visioning document for the town, and the land use code update is where the rubber meets the road with actually implementing a lot of the vision or the goals and objectives that are set forth in the community plan. Third is enhancing review processes, and I'll caveat that by saying enhance review processes where appropriate. I know based on some preliminary discussions, some of the review processes, there may be opportunities to streamline those, but that may not be what's appropriate for the town of Minturn. So I think it's sort of on an as appropriate basis, and when we start looking at the different review processes and how those might be enhanced. Fourth is creating more opportunities for a range of housing options for full-time residents in Minturn. 5 is increasing flexibility of the town's regulations and standards. 6 is exploring options for promoting or incentivizing certain types of development in the community. And 7 is ensuring compliance with court rulings. And this really is just ensuring that the code is constitutional and doesn't violate anybody's civil rights. So in terms of reorganizing and reformatting the code, there were a number of recommendations included in the code assessment. And I'll just quickly walk through those. And again, if there's any questions or comments, feel free to interrupt me. The first recommendation is, again, to consolidate and reorganize the existing chapters that make up the land use code. And the goal of that is to hopefully make the code more user-friendly and more intuitive for everyone to use, not just planning staff and folks who kind of work with it on a regular basis. The hope is to make it a code that's fairly intuitive for anybody to pick up and use. Secondly is addressing inconsistencies, redundancies, and ambiguity in the code. Again, and this is inherent with codes that have been updated over the years in sort of a piecemeal fashion. There's sections of the code that say one thing and then maybe say in another section say something that's different, and that becomes really fun to try and administer and enforce. So through this code update, that'll be one of the key aspects, is making sure that there's no inconsistencies between different sections of the code. And also looking to see if there's redundancies in the code that maybe don't make a lot of sense. In some cases, it may make sense to have sort of reiterate certain regulations, but I think redundancies, it's important to keep those in my mind, keep those to a minimum, because if you ever change the code in the future, that's where you can get caught up, where if you change one section of the code that says something and there's that code language is mirrored elsewhere in the code. If you're not diligent about updating all the sections of the code that sort of say the same thing, then you can start to get run into those issues with inconsistencies. And then ambiguity in the code. I know in the stakeholder meetings there was a fair amount of discussion about ambiguity around how the town currently measures building heights. Excuse me, the high water mark. So things like that, trying to hone in on those regulations that are not exactly clear or don't offer the detail that they need. So trying to reduce ambiguity and gray area as much as possible so that the code doesn't require a ton of interpretation. Third is ensuring that the intent of regulations is clearly described in the code. I think this is an important one, and it definitely came up in the stakeholder meetings. If there's provisions or regulations in the code, for example, landscaping requirements or steep slope or hillside development regulations, things like that, if there's certain regulations related to those sorts of situations, being very clear about what the intent of the regulations are, kind of what, and again, I think this ties back to a sort of visionary or aspirational code to talk a lot or include information in the code about what the town is trying to achieve through these regulations. So it's not just some arbitrary percentage or other requirement restriction that's in the code that isn't clear as to why that's included and what the intent of that is, kind of what the town is trying to achieve. So I think that'll be another important one. And again, that came up in recent discussions about the code. Related to that is ensuring that the sort of graphics, illustrations, diagrams, tables, etc. in the code further bolster those descriptions of the regulatory intent. And I think one of the key things that, and I discussed this with Scott briefly, was having a statement in the code that says if there's ever any issue between illustrations in the code and code language, that the code language always supersedes the illustration. And again, I think this ties to the current graphics in the code for building height. Those aren't really overly descriptive. There's definitely some ambiguity there. So hopefully we get rid of any of that in the code update. But if for some reason there's still some illustrations or diagrams that are not overly clear, the code will have a statement that says that if in that case, you always defer to the code language, which will hopefully be specific. Next is reducing the number of cross-references in the code. And cross-references, they're necessary in some cases. I've dealt with codes where they get carried away with cross-references. And when I'm talking about cross-references, it's if you're in one section of the code and it says, refer to this section of the code for additional information. It forces you to jump around in the code. And again, in some cases, that's necessary and appropriate. In other cases, I've seen it done where it actually makes the code very confusing, and it's easy to miss requirements because you're jumping around so much. You can miss things. So I think looking for opportunities to limit the number of cross-references in the code will be important as we get into this code update. Simplifying code language and reducing the use of technical jargon. Again, this ties back to improving the usability of the code, trying to use more common language rather than terms and acronyms that only design professionals are familiar with, or lawyers or legalese, trying to have the code be as simple as possible in terms of the language. Consolidating, updating, and adding definitions. Excuse me. That'll be important, and I think sounds like the town or the planning commission has already done a fair amount of work on this front, and this ties back to eliminating ambiguity. Having good definitions in your code is always good. Because if somebody tries to dispute a certain term or provision of the code, having clear definitions is helpful to be able to fall back on. And I've seen cases, and I've been involved with projects where projects have actually been denied because definitions left too much gray area for folks either in favor or opposed to a project. And it just opened the door up for getting projects denied because the definitions weren't specific enough. Consolidate standards for specific types of land uses into a quote unquote use specific standard section of the code. Right now, the way the code's formatted with the character areas and then the zone districts within the character areas, there's standards that apply to certain types of uses, land uses like home occupation, bed and breakfast, things like that. And there's specific standards within the zone districts in each character area. And it's a bit confusing because you may have home occupation standards for a zone district in a certain character area that are different than the standards for the a zone district or a same type of use in another zone district in another character area. So it creates, in my mind, an opportunity to really confuse people. So the goal would be to try and consolidate all the standards that are specific to certain types of land uses into a single section so that you have more uniform standards across the board so that it's not sort of a character area or zone district case-by-case situation. And then finally, working to consolidate any character area, parking, lighting, landscaping, sign regulations into a section called development standards, or there may be this could be design standards, something where all these sort of standards for certain types of development projects in town are all consolidated. So the goal would be that it's a one-stop shop. If you know what type of project you're going to do, say you're going to do a mixed-use project in town, you go to figure out, well, is this allowed in the part of town where I want to do my project, and then what sort of standards do I have to keep in mind as I'm designing this project? Again, right now, these standards seem to be kind of scattered throughout the code, which can make usability a little confusing. So under the second theme of developing a code that facilitates the implementation of the town's community plan and strategic plan, first recommendation is to simplify character areas and zone districts. And I recognize that there was some work done as part of the community plan that offers recommendations for consolidating and simplifying the town zone districts. I think this will be, as we get into the land use code update, one of the key first steps that we need to address is figure out what do we do with the character areas, and what do we do, how do we deal with the zone districts within the character areas, and are the recommendations that are set forth in the community plan, is that the direction that the town wants to go, or is there another approach that the town or the community wants to take to try and simplify these different areas that have been defined for Minturn. I think right now, and based on what I've heard, this layering of character areas and then zone districts within character areas is rather confusing for folks. So trying to figure out a good way to have either zone districts or neighborhood areas or something where there's distinct areas in the community and regulations that apply to those areas, and not this necessarily this layering of figuring out what area of town and then what are the zone districts within that area that apply, and so on and so forth. Secondly is exploring options for the type of land use code best suited for Minturn. And when I talk about or refer to the type of land use code, we've already had some discussion about this, but does the town want to go with sort of a traditional land use code, which I would say the existing regulations that the town has would qualify as more of a traditional land use code where you have zoning districts that separate different types of uses. And so it's really kind of more use focused. Your regulations revolve around uses and trying to mitigate impacts of different uses on each other. And a lot of land use codes are really, the ones I've dealt with are formatted that way. That's sort of been the traditional approach for dealing with zoning and land use regulations, is focusing on uses and where different types of uses are appropriate within the community. There's also a form-based option, which we've talked a bit about, and that focuses more on the massing and scaling of buildings and how buildings relate to streets. So it's more building design oriented. And I think, based on my understanding of form-based codes, a true form-based code really doesn't regulate uses to a heavy extent. It's more, here's the type of buildings that are appropriate in different types of in different areas of the town or the community, and whatever happens within that building is kind of up to it's fairly flexible. And then finally, there's the hybrid approach, where you take elements of a traditional land use code and mix those with elements of a form-based code and kind of get a mixture of both types of land use code. And I think a hybrid approach for some communities is maybe a bit more comfortable because it has elements of a traditional code, which a lot of communities are more familiar with, and then maybe is offers a little bit more emphasis on building design by incorporating some form-based code elements. And so I think these two, both simplifying the character areas and zone districts, and then having some discussions about the type of land use code that the community wants or that the town wants, will be some important discussions we have as we get into the land use code update, because those will be, we really need to figure out what we're doing with those two items to before we get into the code, so that we know which direction we're going with the code update. Third is crafting regulations that enable creativity and enhance Minturn's character. The town's character is definitely something that comes up throughout the community plan. It came up in our discussions with stakeholders, as well as you all as the planning commission. And enabling creativity is something that definitely stood out in the stakeholder meetings, and looking for opportunities to have regulations that enable that rather than stifle creativity or make it challenging to be creative. And based on what I remember from the stakeholder meetings, there was a fair amount of discussion about how creativity and creative development in Minturn really adds to the town's sort of funkiness and its character. Fourth is consolidating and updating the use tables to ensure alignment with the community plan. And again, this organization of the existing code, where you have character areas and zone districts within those character areas, there's also use tables for each zone district within the character areas. So you have different use tables sort of scattered throughout the code. So assuming there's some element of a traditional land use code that the town moves forward with, where there's some regulation around different types of land uses, I think it'll be important to work on consolidating the use tables and maybe having just a single use table that users of the code can go to figure out what types of uses are allowed within whatever part of town they're located in. Fifth is ensuring regulations address the community's environmental concerns. And there were a number of objectives in the community plan that related to protecting water quality, air quality, addressing wildfire concerns, and similar types of environmental concerns in the community plan. And so, looking for opportunities to either enhance existing regulations or incorporating additional regulations that work towards achieving the community's objectives when it comes to protecting and enhancing the local natural environment. And then finally, making sure that the land use code aligns with the community's objectives related to transportation in Minturn. And when we're talking about transportation, what stood out to me in the community plan is a couple things is trying to enhance or creating a town that really promotes walking and biking, sort of alternative modes of transportation when you're in the community. And then also there was some discussion about transit-oriented development out at Dow Junction, where there's opportunities to maybe have development that ties in with the eco-transit system, things like that. So looking for opportunities to align the town's land use regulations with those objectives of different ways for the community to get around, both within Minturn and then also to other destinations around the community. So when we talk about enhancing review processes, first recommendation is to explore options to clarify, simplify, and streamline application review procedures. And one of the review procedures that stood out to me when I was going through the town's code was sign permits. And technically, sign permits are supposed to go to the planning commission, planning commission for approval. I'm more familiar with sign permits going sort of that being an administrative review and approval. So again, as I mentioned earlier, I think there may be opportunities to simplify or streamline some of the application review procedures in the town's code, but making sure that fits Minturn. Some communities like to be pro development, and they see review processes and streamlining review processes as a way to be quote unquote pro development. And if that's not the right fit for Minturn, that's fine. I mean, again, there's a lot of emphasis on protecting the town's character, so having multi-step review processes may be what's appropriate for Minturn. So I think really exploring and taking a look at the existing review procedures and saying, yep, these are what we want, or maybe we can loosen up or streamline some of the review procedures again for, say, sign permits, where it really doesn't need to be a multi-step process where you go to the planning commission, then town council or staff, and then the planning commission. Maybe there's ways to make those processes a little simpler. And related to that is improving application requirements. And when I was going through the code, there are some types of applications where it's very clear what types of submittal items are required, and then other applications where it's not so clear. And then one of the things that stood out to me, and I always try and address this when I see it in land use code, is when it comes to public hearings, really putting that responsibility on the applicant. When I worked for the town of Eagle, I would do some public notice for certain types of development applications, and I never liked doing it because if you screw up as a staff person for the town, you're potentially creating liability for the town. That really shouldn't be the town's responsibility. in my mind. If you're an applicant, you come in with an application, the really kind of the responsibility for making sure all the T's are crossed and I's are dotted is on you, not town staff. So right now there's a requirement that the town does public notice in the local newspaper. And so my suggestion, and again, this is one of those more specific recommendations, is to put that responsibility on the applicant or the developer, because they are responsible for doing notice to adjacent property owners, and potentially, I don't know if the town requires this, but posting a sign on the property that has public notice information. So really making all that fall on the applicant's shoulders and not having that on the town. So fourth theme revolved around creating more housing options for full-time residents. And the first recommendation, and again, this is touched on pretty heavily in the community plan, is looking for opportunities to expand the types of housing permitted in Minturn. And this may be looking for types of housing that may not currently be permitted, or looking for opportunities like with accessory dwelling units to make it easier to do those types of housing or dwelling units in Minturn to create more opportunities for full-time residents to live in town. And I think again the full-time resident aspect is really important, and was highlighted in the community plan as well as in discussions with stakeholders, so that we don't expand housing options in Minturn and then all those housing options turn into short-term vacation rentals or second homeowners, that don't allow for more folks to actually live and work on kind of a full-time basis in the community. And related to that is reducing potential barriers to housing development. And there's some discussion in the community plan. There's some recommendations for how to potentially modify minimum lot sizes, lot coverage requirements, parking requirements, things like that. Those types of things are based on my experience, pretty can be project killers for housing projects. If you require too much off-street parking, or if building height restrictions don't work, things like that. And I'm not saying just allow anything to happen. Again, having regulations that protect the character of the community, but maybe looking to modify some standards or requirements like minimum lot size or off-street parking requirements, lot coverage, things like that enable certain types of housing projects to occur that still fit the character of the community.
Matt, are you still there?
I'm still here.
We just lost your presentation for a second.
All right, let me pull that back up. Sorry about that.
No worries.
Was at the end.
No,
Couple more slides.
we've more sections.
All right, am I back on the screen?
Yes.
Okay. So, in terms of increasing flexibility of regulations and standards, first recommendation, and this comes out of the community plan, is evaluating the town's nonconformity regulations. And when we talk about nonconformities, those are things that are often referred to as grandfathered uses or buildings or lots. And in the community plan, it talks about maybe loosening up some of the current regulations for nonconformities so that There's more opportunity to either maintain or enhance existing non-conforming buildings or uses. And I think there's a balance there between having flexibility in those and then potentially creating problems if you allow nonconformities to expand too far. So looking for ways to maybe incorporate some greater flexibility in those regulations. Secondly, is I've seen this in other codes, are alternative compliance measures. And so what these allow is these allow for a developer to come up with a creative solution or work with the community on a creative solution that may not strictly adhere to the town's regulations. And the example I included in the code assessment were off-street parking requirements, where some communities say you have to provide all your parking on your site, your project site, and we're not budging on that. And so an alternative compliance, allowing alternative compliance measures would allow a developer to come in and work with the town, the planning commission staff, town council, and say, well, okay, here's what I need in terms of parking for my project. Maybe there's an opportunity for me to accommodate that in a parking lot somewhere that's, say, within 300 feet of my project, or a parking structure, things like that. Allowing or incorporating some flexibility in the code so that there's opportunities for some creative solutions, while and again, this is where the intent of the code becomes important. So having some regulations that are flexible, but at the same time ensuring that the intent of the code is met, so that somebody doesn't come in and propose something that's totally contrary to what the community is trying to achieve. And then third, this came up in our discussions with some of the stakeholders, is evaluating historic preservation regulations. And I guess there's a bit of concern about sort of blowing up the scope of the land use code update too far, and starting to look at too many sections of the code, of the municipal code, as we do this land use code update. But there was a fair amount of discussion about maybe looking for some opportunities to incorporate some greater flexibility in the town's historic preservation regulations. So I think that's something that maybe there's worth some discussion about what exactly that looks like, and how that might be achieved through this land use code update. And these are the last two items here. So the sixth theme, in terms of exploring options for promoting or incentivizing certain types of development in Minturn, there's a variety of different types of incentives that are non sort of monetary incentives that some communities incorporate into their code, like unit bonuses, where if you do certain types of dwelling units, or you set aside a certain number of units for workforce housing, the code has some built-in incentives that allow the developer to maybe put another story on the building, or have some additional units that maybe exceed the density restrictions for a certain area in town, things like that. There's also opportunities to explore fee waivers, where appropriate, things like that could enable some incentives for certain types of development that the community wants to have happen. And not, I think what's important to note, and I noted this in the code assessment, not all the possible incentives that are out there will necessarily be addressed through the code update. Some of those are more policies, and maybe deal with other sections of the town's municipal code, that would need to be addressed outside of the code update. So those sorts of incentives we may want to discuss to an extent, but not spend too much time on since they're not necessarily related to the code update. And then finally, ensuring that the code is compliant with court rulings. And there's two that stood out to me. And the first is sign regulations, and there's been some recent court rulings related to sign regulations that don't allow you to regulate signs based on the content of the sign. Some older sign codes that I've seen and dealt with, for example, allow realtors to have more signage allowances than other types of professionals or uses in the community. And so it's important to have sign regulations that don't revolve around regulating the content of, or sort of the messaging that's displayed on the sign. Of course, you can restrict obscene language or things like that, or that aren't necessarily protected under the First Amendment. But really trying to be quote unquote content neutral in sign regulations is important. So making sure that sign regulations are really focused on location of signs, size of signs, types of signs, things like that, and trying to get out as much, if there's any restrictions on the messaging that signs can have, or saying that, well, you can only display commercial messages in this part of town. That's important. You need to allow both commercial and non-commercial messaging on signs, kind of regardless of where they are in the community. And then another one that stood out to me is regulations for adult entertainment establishments. And this is one that is again sort of a First Amendment issue, and one that I think Scott and I need to have further discussions with the town attorney about. But it's my understanding that communities cannot prohibit these types of uses. The way I've seen them dealt with in other places is there's sort of a long list of standards that apply to these, and usually they're only allowed as a special use in the industrial part or industrial zone district. So there's an allowance for them, but the hoops you have to jump through if you wanted to open this type of business in a community, there's a lot of sort of red tape you have to cut through. But again, I don't know that communities are allowed to just flat out prohibit that type of use. So that's all I have for now. I will stop talking and answer any questions or comments that you all may have.
All right, thanks, Matt. Does anybody need a quick break, or you want to?
Let's take a quick break, because then we'll probably get into it a bit.
Okay, Matt, we're going to take a 5-minute break.
Okay.
Do it.
Yeah.
Did you number them sequential? Prioritize it down to 2.
We don't want to get into the state, so we just want to take the 3 top items I have on the notepad.
Okay. Come back to the meeting. Thanks for the break, Matt. So I'm going to start at this end tonight. It's a short end, and then we'll go that way for a change. We usually start there and go this way. So Tom, go for it.
Good decision. I only have 2 things.
Well, that's why I started with you.
And then I will defer all the rest of my time to Mike.
Thank you.
So first off, yeah, I look forward to
That's why we sat you two next,
I know
because I like the way you bounce off each other.
Been a long week for.
it's easier for me to hit him. I look forward to the product that comes out the other end. Those are, I don't have any issues with any of those recommendations. One format item, just continuing to press that button on the cross-reference comment. Whatever format you use, footnote format, whatever, but something that has specific reference to avoid, just what you want to avoid in regards to people jumping around. Specific governing document, the section, the chapter, the page, and all the subsequent documents, or the next one that said applicant would naturally refer to amplify or provide further guidance or regulations. And then the other one is just more of a question, so I just have a contextual concept in my head as to what that would look like in discussion with traditional or form or hybrid. But from what I've derived from it, I'm kind of a fan of the hybrid, obviously. But if you could kind of provide an example in a particular zone district or character district, whatever we're gonna end up calling them, of what that would look like. Either one.
Sure, I can do my best. So a hybrid approach might, so say the 100 block, and I know there's already been a fair amount of work that's been done there. But a hybrid approach might be to say, well, here's sort of the scale of the types of buildings that are in the 100 block area of Minturn. And we want to continue to have that sort of scale of buildings for future development. So having some regulations around that sort of define a building envelope for future development in terms of height, setbacks. And I know a lot of that's already included in the current code. But also looking at, well, maybe we need to have some build to lines where we require buildings to be built to the sidewalk. Maybe they need to incorporate some sort of outdoor seating area or things like that that really kind of work towards having development that creates the type of character that the community wants to see happen in the 100 blocks. So you'd have some regulations around building design, and then also regulations around what types of uses are permitted in that building, whether that's apartments, restaurants, shops, things like that. So it would be a mixture of different types of regulations, and it'd probably be either easier to kind of offer some examples, and I'm happy to maybe find some other land use codes from other communities where they have a hybrid approach, and share that with you all, just so you can get a sense of what that might look like. And again, I think with a hybrid approach, it's really up to the community about what the mix of form-based regulations versus more traditional regulations is. You can definitely sort of find what balance works best for your community, if that makes any sense.
This kind of oddly go hand in hand with streamlining the process in the fact that we designate an area hybrid, it kind of removes the variance requirements in cases, but leaves it up to kind of the letter of the law versus the spirit of the law. And now it's up to staff and commission and council to say, we're adhering to the character, but we want to have a variance, so to speak, on this for whatever reason, because we've zoned it hybrid.
Matt, if I might jump in, I
Sure.
think I can maybe address that. In my mind, a hybrid code that could work for this town would be what Matt described. But if one of our goals is to clearly describe the intent and purpose of a zone district or a neighborhood, that's step one, right? So you're out here and you're drawing people into, like, here's what's going on in this neighborhood. Here's what's really important to keep Minturn. Here are the core elements of whatever that we see in the built environment or the forms of buildings. That would be then followed up by text, right? That is more regulatory, like these are the minimum standards and these are And then it's coupled with really clear graphics. Another one of our things that we think are a main goal that we heard from you, we heard it from all the stakeholders, like that's one of the main tools that we need to employ. So if you have a really good description of what the zone district or neighborhood is and what the intent of the following regulations are or standards and what we're trying to achieve, mixed with really clear graphics or illustrations of what we're trying to achieve, that might cut down on the amount of people asking for variations, or I don't know. I also think that's going to be dealt with through the nonconformity section as well.
Well, I'm just, basically what you're saying is you're not gonna have a zone district that's gonna have traditional and form requirements depending on literally by the block, so to speak. It's either one district is a form
No,
or one
I think if we go to a hybrid, it should be
across the board.
across the board for each zone district, so it's consistent. No matter where you live or where you're looking to buy and build a house or whatever, the same formula effectively, as a user of that code is for each zone.
Right,
district.
I'm just trying to understand how you wanna build something and we've determined, no, you need to adhere to the traditional set of requirements. Where if you're,
So
that's not really what you're saying.
the traditional comes in of a traditional code, like our code is all, it's all text. And then we have this section of illustrations that's separate. If you go into a hybrid code in the future, perhaps, and you go to the Old Town residential zone district, you will have text that describes and maybe some photos or illustrations of what's there now, describing what's going on in that neighborhood or that zone district. You will have then standards that are also text. That's the traditional part, right? This minimum setbacks, maximum height, these types of things. But again, they're kind of predicated on
It's really
the
a form.
purpose and intent statement. We already have that effectively. But I think what we can do a better job at is describing the purpose of those different areas. But it's where, in my mind, where it becomes more hybrid is where it starts getting into more discussions on existing and in, you know, the aspirational form that we want to maintain or enhance. And then that's coupled with graphics. So it's this, you don't go to one section to read code and then another section to look at pretty graphics and illustrations of how you're supposed to interpret the code. It's all mixed into one section. Does that sound about right to you, Matt?
Yeah, it would be, again, I would agree, Scott, it would be across the board. It wouldn't be on a zone district by zone district basis. It would be a hybrid approach to all the zone districts or character areas or neighborhoods, whatever areas are defined in the community. It would be, yeah, that mixture of regulations around sort of the character development that the community wants in different parts of town. And then also, again, the traditional code sort of focuses on uses. So what do you use the building or the property for? Is it for housing? Is it for a carpentry shop? Things like that. So that's where you start to have there may be some more regulations that explain the character of development that the committee wants to see happen, while also having some of those use regulations that dictate what types of activities you're allowed to do on different properties in the community. And if you did a hybrid approach, you could maybe look to loosen up some of the land use types, maybe make them broader. I know a lot of codes will have very specific types of uses defined. And so maybe a hybrid approach would maybe make broaden up types of land uses so it's not super prescriptive in terms of barbershop, cheese shop, hair salon, things like that. It could just be a retail business or something like that. So it's a little more flexible.
Oh, yeah. Thanks.
Yeah, all this is time pushing.
All right. Might take 5 minutes, I'll try.
Actually, only 32 seconds left. so.
Oh, all right. 5 minutes, 32 seconds. Um. I have a few different bullet point things that I'd like to start out with saying, and then if we get into things further down the road, I might have some other comments. I think to start with, a little bit off point. Might need to take notes, but a little bit off point. But since it was brought up as far as historical goes, I saw that the historical whatever, historical preservation society was looking at passing an ordinance in regards to decreasing the setbacks, and I was, trying to figure that out. As far as that goes, my feeling is on that, if we're changing code, it should come to P and Z as well, instead of going directly to council. And if it doesn't comply with current code, variances should be required. And now I'll move into the points of what we've been talking about as far as your template goes, Matt. Some of the main things, one, it's a good template. It's good to know where everybody's thoughts are. Everybody on this board has, different thoughts, and we always come together pretty well together. Because what one of us doesn't ask, the other one usually asks. That being said, just to getting into the things that stand out to me as far as your template goes. Most importantly, I'll go with the easy ones first. As far as parking, reducing parking requirements. I always say it, people say we don't have parking problems. We have the municipal lot, but one day we might not have the municipal lot when stuff starts getting developed downtown. And, when construction happens, it takes, a lot of people to build, and I think, even back in the day when Sage had sticky fingers, I would love to have gotten more coffee and stuff from Sage, but fact is, I didn't have 30 minutes to go park in the municipal lot and walk back up to town. So, parking's a sticky issue for me. I technically have 10 spots, so that's good. But then the biggest thing that stands out for me is, in general, looking at your future proposed zoning changes. The 100 block is pretty much just got finished. I think people were working on it way before I got on planning and zoning, and I think getting into changing stuff on that would be pretty intense since it was just passed. As far as changes in general, especially through like the 100 block the 800 block, for example, I think that my biggest issue is, I think right now we're at like 40%, 45% lot coverage. And
I'm sorry, Nelson, what? Building coverage is 45% current.
building coverage is 45%. I said, looking at what you have proposed, 45% is a lot, regardless of your lot size. Even on the little lots on Taylor Street, people have really nice houses that they got to fit with their 45%. 45%, bless you. 45%, I don't really think, there needs to be zone changes through the 800 block are really questionable to me. I think, uses and stuff like that could be discussed, but the lot coverage is a big sticking point, as it's been told to me, by, smart people. I know a lot of builders, more lot coverage means more incentive to make your numbers work. but the reason, as the community plan states, to keep Minturn, I would think that regardless of the zones down past the 800 block, you know, there might be flexibility with certain stuff, but I think 45% is 45%. You know, that's how I, you know, it's a pretty sticky thing for me as far as that goes, because, you know, technically with what's being proposed, you know, right now, you know, with me at 39% and what's being proposed, I can add another 1,400 feet. I don't know where I'm going to put it, but, if we're going to approve it, I got the infrastructure in. So, anyway, 45% is important. And, you know, last but not least, like I said, you know, we want to keep Minturn, 45%. Parking is important. And I think it's also important, especially with, you know, the template's a good format. It states, you know, what you're thinking, Matt, you know, what you've taken in so far on it. And I think that it'd be great, since it'd be great for us potentially in January to have a, you know, a work session with council just to discuss, you know, just the basic layouts that, you know, and any other concerns that we all come up with today.
Am I allowed to say something?
Wait, let me finish.
It's your turn.
And whether we discuss that later, you know, or if we have to vote that we want to have a meeting or whatever, I think that it would be really good before we keep moving on and on. If we have some sticky points, we're all appointed by council. Let's just make sure that we're all sit close to the same page is my suggestion
Can I,
and request.
Sage, before you jump in, can I just add a couple things? So Michael, just to be clear, Matt just took the recommendations out of the community plan and put them in this document. He's not recommending those. Those are already recommendations that were included in the community plan.
Community plan said to increase the lot coverage in certain areas
Yes,
to those specific numbers.
Yep. Yeah.
Well,
we're
disagree.
already at 80% in some of those zone districts, so.
But again, the recommend.
Okay, hold on.
We didn't
go
hold
through
on,
that.
hold on.
We didn't go through that.
Yeah, so,
Scott finished talking.
and I've got my own thoughts on January and where we need to go next, but we should talk about that when we get to that point. So, Sage, go ahead. I'm sorry.
Do you mind if Sage comes next and she's ready?
I was only in a certain area, not the whole
Oh,
place.
thank
You're
you.
good. It's not the whole town.
I definitely feel like we should talk to town council before, we should actually meet together, is what I feel. Planning and zoning and town council,
I'm sure we'll have. a
and that's how I
for all this.
feel we should come to a resolution about this.
About what? That's what I'm wondering, because that's just so we're clear, if we're gonna have a joint work session with them, we have to be really clear.
Lot
about what-
coverage to start with.
But hold on, we're not there yet.
Get
like-
through here yet.
So, and I'll be happy to elaborate on my response to that, but there will be a time and a place to have those discussions, and we're still up here. We're not diving into
Can we just have
50
like a,
versus 45%.
you know, like a good old meeting between each other, like have some pizza, like together and like figure it out?
But what are we figuring out?
I mean, like,
I got 3 different things.
I do too. So,
Okay,
like,
hold on.
Okay.
May I make a comment?
Sure.
I agree with having a co-meeting with council. But I think we could get a little further down the line and get a little bit more of this together and then sit down and see how they feel we're doing. Are we going, you know, I understand what people are saying. We'd like them to be involved to some degree too with us, but I don't know that it has to be right now.
yeah, no, doesn't have to be.
So definitely a good idea, but I think there's a time and a place for that, and I don't know that we're quite there yet. So,
I
but we
don't,
can talk more about that.
Okay,
I don't foresee the need until a draft product is on the streets.
on the streets.
What?
I would also say that we're about to have an election.
Okay,
We're gonna have a very different council in April,
possibly,
possibly.
But there's also.
unless you know something I don't know.
I'm just anticipating
else?
there's gonna be ways to,
There's one more thing. There's
Sure.
also a lot to be said about brainstorming and both of those teams coming together, which we typically don't do, which we probably should do like once or twice a year. We should,
agree. Yeah.
is awesome.
No, joint.
Okay,
That's it.
back to Jeff.
Michael, is
Tom, please,
Michael done?
please, we're going on Jeff now.
Totally.
All right.
I'm totally.
Well, I think you've done a great job, getting to this point. It certainly highlights some of the hot buttons, which obviously are hot on some of the, all of our agendas on this council, on this commission. And I think it's obvious how eager we are to jump into some of those areas. But we are getting the cart before the horse. And I think as long as we can keep our eye on where we're at and not waste our time trying to jump ahead and wait till we get there. And if we need to prioritize, maybe Scott with the time to take, I don't know what the next step is with Matt, but whenever we actually are going to start digging into this and really getting into the weeds. Obviously, we've talked about in the past, are we going to go in a chronological order of the format, chapter by chapter, proposed new structure, or are we going to jump to the hot buttons first and pick the ones that we think are going to take time? And we've also talked about community engagement, which is going to be really important, obviously, on some of these more than others. But when the time comes, I'm as interested to hear from the community members of certain blocks, not just 100 block, 200 block, whatever, but there's going to be certain people in certain blocks that can't wait to come and fill the room and talk. And then there might be other zone districts that 2 people show up.
Yeah.
Because maybe what's being proposed is less impactful or whatever. But I think that's important for us to sort of prioritize at some point whenever you or Lynn or whatever we decide that is, and come up with what future agendas might look like. I think as far as the form-based versus the traditional, I mean, my gut all along has kind of been feeling like we're going to end up in a hybrid of some sort. And I think what's important for us to understand or keep in our mind is that it's almost kind of like, for a lack of a better comparison, of like, if your kid has a symptom, rather than put a label on what he is or she is from the symptom, just treat the symptom. And so we're kind of like, I feel like we're just going to end up with different sections of the town that may have more illustrations, or certain parts of the code that may have more things that seemingly are form-based, and then there's going to be other parts that might be more text or whatever. But rather than say, well, this is this and this is that, it's just, I think it's going to end up a hybrid in a way, and it's certainly going to be way better than what we have either way.
Yeah.
So I think one of the questions I had maybe for Matt and Scott is, have you guys ever had like a charrette that, and I don't even know if it's possible, but like if you had a traditional code on your right hand and you had a form-based code in your left hand, or if you were doing a charrette for a particular district with certain zoning, and you came in and you were just Joe developer, you said, I want to come in and do this. And if you use traditional code, what product would you end up with? The same use. And what would you end up with in a form-based code? And would you end up with the same finished product, or would they be drastically different? And is it a waste of time to think of that? Or is it like worth maybe even pursuing? Because for us, I think a lot of people, and maybe the public might, they don't know the difference. You know, most people aren't going to know the difference of a form, but what it really means to use a form-based code versus a traditional code. And I just wonder if you end up with the same, you know, whatever.
Same.
Well, the same product. Do you end up like, because I think about like certain developers that have come through in the 100 block and they said, I want to do a hotel. And the current code didn't allow this, you know, these people to do what they wanted to do. Yeah, etc. And so like, we're trying to get to a point where it's on one hand easier for people to use the code and know what they can do, easier for the staff to use, all this, you know, streamlining, but by the same token, like, do you end up with the same product if you have one type of code versus another type of code? And I think we're going to end up with, like I said, a hybrid code anyway. So I don't know that it's even makes it that big of a difference, but I just kind of wonder, like, would one be more restrictive?
I have a question for you. So what would you say, like, in terms of Minturn? How would you say that would?
I just think because like, as long as I've lived here, keep Minturn funky, all of the things that sort of are less restrictive. Like we want to give our residents enough freedom to build something that has a lot of character, right?
Right.
And so I think that's probably why we're going to end up with a hybrid code that is going to, you know, that's one of the things that, like, Matt, you brought it up, like in your definitions or in your uses, in your use tables, to have this 5-page list of barbershops and blah, 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 blah of what you can do versus just saying retail. Well, you know, on one hand, it's less restrictive to just say you can do retail over here in this town. And the more things you list on the page, the more things you have to deal with because you forgot to put it on there.
Right.
Right. So I would vote for more of a big net that allows you to do more things in a certain amount of town. And if for some reason, you know, there's certainly enough governmental quasi judicial process that goes on where if somebody comes through with a use that is, oh my gosh, we never thought of that. Well, I mean, that's why you have a process. You have a public process. And if it seems like it's going to be a detriment to that zone for this person to come in and propose whatever it is, then you can just deal with it through the public process. But you don't necessarily have to paint yourself into a corner of like, well, it doesn't say you can do this here, or,
Yeah.
you know what I mean?
And that gets to that fundamental difference between form-based code and a traditional.
Exactly.
Traditional is all about impacts,
Right.
separating residential from commercial, from industrial. Matt did a great job of describing that in his code assessment. And to your point, I have never participated in a charrette that kind of takes a hypothetical
Yeah, it's like an experiment, right?
and trying to run it through two different sausage making processes.
Yeah,
Right?
like, does the sausage taste kind of the same, or is it
I-
completely like
Yeah.
a Wagyu hot dog?
It's a Wagyu
Italian
hot dog,
sausage.
right?
I already don't like it.
So, yeah, and I don't know, like,
Yeah,
to me, that whole I like the part of that Matt described of the traditional focuses on uses, and the form-based focuses more on what the building looks like. And because of that, I mean, part of me thinks that the form-based side of it is how you end up with this cookie cutter homogeneous, no character.
Yeah.
Right? And that we don't want. Like that to me is not Minturn. But by the same token, restricting a bunch of uses to me is also doesn't feel like Minturn. Because I feel like in today's economic climate of how quickly people's jobs are changing and there's new, there's just this giant creation of like different types of jobs and how people are working. For a government to keep up with that,
Good point.
I think it's really tough.
I can envision something again, kind of going back to these really well thought out, well vetted with you and the town council and the citizens and the neighborhoods. What is the intent? What's important to people? And if there are a short list of things that just are absolutely not a good idea in a particular neighborhood or a character area or whatever, have a short list or be specific in that purpose statement saying, these are the things we're trying to avoid. Spend most of it saying, this is what we're trying to create or enhance or continue. And then backing it up with these graphics. You're right. Some places might have fewer examples of the graphics that we're talking about or examples of the existing character, and other places might be more robust.
Yeah, I mean, we only have a few districts where we allow commercial.
Right.
Or mixed use for another, but then in all of those other districts, like there's a ton of people working out of their homes, and there's a lot of people that are doing things that we probably don't even know.
There are,
They may be under that adult sector. I don't know.
we don't know what they are. We know they're.
Anyway, like just that, I don't know. I think I've made my point, but the last thing I want to say is just a little more specific in terms of I want to make sure we don't miss the opportunity, and maybe we've already dealt with it, but like I know with that whole deal with the MICVA and the legal side of it and RLUIPA and all that stuff, and we, at one point we didn't allow religious uses in a certain amount of part of town, and that's probably been cleaned up, I would assume, but I want to make sure that we're not discriminating against anyone.
No anti-Semitism.
Yeah, in any part of town. And to that point, you brought up the realtors, people putting realtor signs or advertising. What about in election years? What about people, there was a time when there was someone had a F Biden sign or flag hanging outside their
I was
house.
thinking the same thing.
Right?
Yeah.
And I know that that's probably covered by the First Amendment rights to
Yep.
hang a flag that says whatever you want. But is there an opportunity for us to write something into our code that at least allows us to curb some vulgar language maybe, or
Well, especially since it was right across from where the school bus stopped.
right
Literally,
in
literally
right in downtown?
downtown commercial where the school bus stopped.
Did Richard obviously weighed in on that heavily, but it came down to the political free speech, right? As opposed to other content related restrictions.
Right, it came down to just free speech in general. It does not. There is no definition really for vulgarity, as vulgarity changes over the years. Obviously, what is appropriate now wasn't appropriate 20 years ago, which wasn't appropriate 20 years before that. So, we cannot regulate content of signs. We can only regulate design of signs. So we can weigh in on color and material and height and size and all of these other things. But if you have to read it to make a determination of whether or not it's appropriate and allowed, then at that point, you've already violated the First Amendment. So that is how the town attorney explained it to us when we went through that whole thing, because town attorney definitely weighed in on that.
I mean, a flag's not a sign. Obviously, somebody just expressing
Right.
whatever they want.
But it was expressed to us that if you have to read the sign to regulate it, at that point, you've already violated the First Amendment. So we can weigh in on everything else about the sign, but the
And
actual
does that include
content,
Location?
we can regulate where the sign is. Yeah,
Which would have made a difference if it was on the back instead of the front,
right. I don't know that we've
or the side.
gotten into the habit of regulating people's personal flags rather than signs.
Right.
No, I want.
Anyhow, I see his point, though.
Yeah,
Okay.
okay, so I think.
Amanda,
Hi, guys.
hi.
I'm down here for today. So obviously I'm really familiar with our code today. So, you know, I went obviously through all of our packages and I thought the assessment was really well done. So thanks, Matt. I was looking at more from a tactical standpoint of what we may need in the next iteration as we start getting into the weeds of things. So those are my comments to really bring to the table. The first was, well, I call them races, but it's the, you know, what roles people have doing what in the processes that, to administer the code. And one of the things that I really wanted to see was what was Matt's envision to future state. And this is really kind of two-prong, one from efficiency, because that's always been something we've been talking about. How do we make this code more efficient and, you know, can operate? But also I wanted to see it because we are a really small town. We have a really small administrative staff. And if we are moving buckets of work or tasks around between council and commission to administration, that we need to be cognizant of that and realize that movement and potential resource impact to the town. Yes,
Just clarification point, are you talking about
it's,
you have a new code in place, who is
Does
responsible
what?
for reviewing and approving which, okay.
yep.
That is a huge point, and you're absolutely on point, because yeah, there are certain things that we probably can't avoid. Let's say the council reviewing.
Yeah.
But if we can streamline things and make more efficiency, that's what you're talking about, right?
Exactly, make more efficiency. But if we move like 10 of those document reviews to staff and we don't have the staff to support it, then that could become a bottleneck in the processes coming to that final commission. So I just really wanted to see kind of when we go into this tactically, especially in these process spaces, you know, what it is today and what Matt envisions as future state, because we may have to have like an interim state in order to be able to accommodate, you know, like it just,
I hear you.
yeah.
So my future state, Matt, I'll be interested in your opinion as well. But you know, if I keep going back up to the purpose and intent statements, if we're clear there, and if we're clear in our, whether it's standards for dimension, illustrations, whatever it is, so we're painting a very clear picture. And this goes back to, I think, your first discussion as a planning commission about what you thought was important moving forward in this. And Tom, I think you brought this up. You brought it up tonight, I think, which was, or maybe it was somebody else, provide kind of a roadmap. If we have acronyms, define the acronyms. I think that was something you talked about. If there's maybe this was Amanda that said, if there's a process, how do we explain the process from step 1 to step 10 to get people through this? So all these things combined with, in my mind, a perfect world, we have examples of a sufficient application. So if someone goes to our code, they get all these data points, they get a roadmap. How do you get through this process without getting killed? And then there's this process guide. We already have process guides, but how do they become more illustrative, illustrate a good application versus a bad? An application that will be accepted readily and you breeze right to DRB or to planning commission for whatever you're doing, and one that's going to probably get rejected. Those types of things, like, because right now it's just a guessing game, especially for people that may not do this every day. Those types of things, I think, could address what you're saying. If more of it gets shifted onto staff, that could be a burden, unless we're giving people better signals up front and along the way to say, when it gets to Madison or I, it's not that big of a lift. as it could be. Does that make sense? It's a
Yes.
better application. We're spending less time with it. It gets through the process quicker. That should be part of our goal.
Yes, and you articulated my, like, when we go to this next step, seeing those process, I would call them process flow or process steps.
Mhm.
I think will help for us as a commission to identify potential areas where maybe what we're proposing isn't the best for the town, I guess.
Gotcha.
And then my next thing, which is also super, again, very tactical, again, I'm not as in the weeds as all of the rest of my peers on the commission, but it really has to do with the appendix. So I was trying to, in my silly mind, taking what was used to be our chapter 16 and then going the suggestion reorganization, which I actually really like the reorganization and the consolidation, but I was struggling with trying to map the old to the new in that document. So like when we start to get into the weeds, if we have, or Matt has some of that document, I think it'll be helpful for us, or at least for me, to know maybe what will be a boiling point, or if we have removed something that then needs to be built back in, or, like just having that mapping between the current organization in chapter 16 to the reorganization, I think will be helpful as we start to talk into the weeds. Those were my only two those are my two comments on my initial review. And then just on my peers' comments, I just wanted to say that, the hybrid seems like I agree with the rest of everyone that the hybrid's going to be kind of, I think the way we're going to end up going. I would strive for this group to decide whether we want that traditional kind of code statements first or the purpose statements come first. I think in the descriptions of how Matt has done the zones right now, the purpose comes first and then that kind of traditional description comes next. And I thought that was really nice that way. And so that would be my vote, is purpose first and then traditional versus the opposite. And then the other piece was that I think I also really agree with Sage and Jeff on getting with council when it's appropriate. So I think it's premature now, but getting when it's appropriate, where we really see where that community plan maybe triggers some boiling points, or like the 50%, things like that, like triggers those areas where it could be a hot topic, both internally and maybe when we're trying to get through the approval of the code. So that was it. Thank you.
Now it's my turn. One thing I have to say is I don't know why it jumped at me, but in the existing code, this sentence was used multiple times, that what we want is while maintaining the visual character and scale of Minturn. It didn't say funkiness. It said the visual character and scale. And I think that kind of hit to me as more of a description of what people want. They want to see the beauty. They want to see, that kind of thing. And it's in here multiple times. So whoever did our existing table, that was a big thing back at the time, because it came out like 4 or 5 times in those things.
You wanted to say funky?
No, I want to say existing character and scale and funkiness. How's that? And historic. That was just a little thing. I think some of the things that I had written down, we will get to when we get into more depth. R1 and R2 state lot coverage and height. R3 does not. Why?
So I can respond to that. As Scott mentioned, those recommended zone districts are the ones that were included in the community plan. So I unfortunately wasn't involved with that. So I don't know why certain zone districts have lot size and more detail to them than others do.
Okay, well, it's something that I'd like us to look at. The other thing that I don't.
Can I jump in real
Yeah.
quick? If I remember correctly, Madison, certainly jump in if you recall. I think those were specifically called out for those zone districts or recommended zone districts. because those were the areas that we thought could be appropriate for those changes and needed to be changed in order to achieve some of the comprehensive plan goals. Other zone districts, not so much.
Doesn't it need to be specific?
Well,
Well,
we'll get
that's,
there.
I guess that's what I'm saying is when we went through that process, the SE group, as they were making their recommendations and putting together the plan, specifically focused on those particular recommended zone districts as.
We will be getting to those in that
Yes.
section.
Yeah,
Okay,
yeah.
that's my question. Did
We're
we
gonna
miss it? Was it missed?
We're gonna revisit.
Yeah.
Yeah.
No, the way we did it, then if it wasn't.
Okay.
Generic covered, I'd already applied.
I like the hybrid idea. I think it's a great learning experience for us and it will take time, but I think that's probably where we also should go. There will be a lot of discussion for me when it comes to the historic. I have attended every meeting but one. And that process is still in its learning, still in its education. I think the suggestion made here, if they are a commission and that is their job, then they should do it. It's like our job is to look at new builds. Our job is to look at remodels. Council, it's just a recommending board. And I think they should learn to maintain that part of their job and learn what that means. I don't think it's a time yet when we can make the decision to change that. From what I've seen at those meetings, there's a lot of questions still out there working with the historic. And we need to get that down before we start making further possible changes. That's just my thought. The other thing I want to suggest, because I have been there and I did go through the stakeholders, I really think the stakeholder meetings should be held here in front of us so we can all hear it. So we all know what those people are saying and who those people are saying that. They know who we are and what we're saying. It should be the opposite. It needs to be transparent. It needs to be transparent if Joe Schmidt is sitting in that audience and wants to know who the stakeholders are.
Yeah.
Who did we attack? Who did we go to? Who brought us those talks?
So
We published all
we,
that.
we did publish those and it is
You
transparent.
on the internet, yes.
Yeah.
But not everybody knew that, number one. Not everybody read it, number one. And if people are here, they should be here. We're not getting one-on-ones. I'm not coming to you and listening to just you and me. You're listening to us as a group and we're being expressed and we're being transparent to the public. And I really think those meetings need to be, after going to them, after hearing them, I think they need to be transparent to the public, just like every other meeting is. Like
So-
council is, like historic commission is, like we are.
It's nice.
So I'm not sure that we're gonna have a bunch more stakeholder meetings.
I
think there's-
realize that, but
there might be some other
it was
opportunities.
mentioned in here, there might be, so
Yeah.
I'm just bringing it up.
Okay,
I just really think that's important.
Yeah.
And I think they need to be here in town hall where they can be put on Zoom. If they have to come in on Zoom, if that's a problem, that's one thing. Where other people, like if Jeff couldn't come to the meeting or people last time couldn't come to the stakeholder meetings because they were during the day and people, I understand it because you're bringing people in who work and that's their job. And so that's when they would like to do it. But perhaps if it was on Zoom and people could watch it at home and see it, it'd be a little different. The other thing I noticed when there were two of them held at the Agora and they were quite noisy. It was hard to hear some of it.
Right.
So that's another reason. There were trucks going by, kids running around, dogs barking, everything else was happening at the same time. And I think this is a very important thing for our town. This is for years. This has been talked about. It's now happening. Let's do it right the first time. Sorry, Matt, that's not anything to do with you.
Who's Joe Schmidt?
He's the guy sitting over there in that chair.
The ghost?
Yes, the
ghost
ghost.
Joe Schmidt?
Yes. But I understand that a lot of these things that we are going to get further in depth on. So I think that was all I had to say also. Thank you.
I have one.
Hold on.
I have one unanswered question. Just, and just to be clear,
Be lot coverage.
don't worry
I
about it.
don't
We're
think we
gonna
should
talk
sit
about
those
it.
guys
I'm
next to
doing
each
it.
other ever again.
Go,
to your whatever you want. The, so my question regards to, the historical committee's proposed ordinance that's being drafted to change the setback, which I believe changes the code. Are we being bypassed, or is that coming to us before it goes to council?
Madison, you can address this, but HPC is a separate committee that's appointed by council that has no responsibility or relativity to this planning commission, correct?
So we're changing chapter 19, which is not the planning commission's purview. Y'all don't have anything to do with chapter
But
19.
as individuals, we're allowed to attend and
Absolutely.
comment.
Lynn attends every meeting. Yeah,
But
absolutely.
I want you, except one, and I want you to understand one thing. I stood up at the last meeting and clarified, because I was put on point twice by somebody on that board, asking me to answer questions in my position of being chair from planning and zoning, which is wrong. I was not there from planning and zoning. I cannot speak from planning and zoning at that point. And I stood up and clarified that last week and said that any questions they have of me in that position or anybody else on this board they need to come here and speak to us at a public meeting.
You just spoke it.
And it's something I've had an interest in my whole life. And I'm learning about it. And that's why I want to be there. And if there's something that I know, maybe, as I said, I've had clients, customers, and residents for 40 years telling me what they love about this town. If at an appropriate time, I can speak to one of those positions or one of those questions as a store owner, a business owner, a resident, whatever, but I will not speak and have my answer taken as the chairman of planning and zoning. That's not my position there. And I'm going to continue that. So
I think that's a great idea, because I would much rather speak as myself than as any part of the planning commission.
Yes, so if any of y'all do attend planning commission meetings, it will be in your capacity as a citizen, not as your capacity as a planning commission.
Council.
So that still doesn't answer Mike's, so it's chapter 19, but does it impact, will it cause a discrepancy between chapter 19 and chapter 16 with what they're
So
proposing?
all specific
I haven't read the ordinance,
regulations,
sorry, Mike.
all specific regulations on historic preservation and historically designated structures are within chapter 19.
Yep.
Chapter 19 has adopted a completely different set of design guidelines. We've adopted the Secretary of Interior's design guidelines that are put out by the National Park Service, which may or may not be in line with chapter 16's design guidelines.
Okay.
So they're a completely separate, different set of regulations, different ways of applying those regulations. So if there's something specific to historically designated properties, their regulations are going to take precedent over chapter 16. Y'all will still review any new or changes to the existing structure, any new structures on lots, that's still there, but I would then put in any staff report that went to you. Here's how this applies, or here's how this goes with chapter 19 and how it's been approved by the Historic Preservation Commission.
It decreases the setback, man, if you look at it.
So I have one question. Kind of in line with Amanda's point, basically roles and responsibilities, but the current table 4 existing review procedure, how obviously it's broken out by in the legend, is that kind of the direction we're going to go in line with what she's talking about in regards to streamlining that process? Because
So
as
it's
silly as
like,
it sounds, it's basically like Schoolhouse Rock, how a bill becomes a law,
Mhm.
in all honesty.
Yeah, and it's not really, I mean, I'm used to seeing more detailed races, but it's not that.
So
It's
I can
page-
clarify,
Yeah,
are you talking about the table in the code assessment?
yeah, we're talking about, it's like on page 21, Matt.
21 of
Yeah,
the packet,
so-
12 of your assessment.
Okay, so that table, what I tried to do there is summarize the existing processes that are sort of explained in the land use code. And when I was trying to say, here's all the different types of applications that the town currently has and the different steps or process that somebody has to go through for those different types of applications. There's some items that there was a question for me in terms of like a pre-application conference with staff. Is that required? That wasn't necessarily clear. So I was just using that table to provide an overview of the existing processes so that when we get into a discussion about streamlining or clarifying review processes, that's sort of a starting point.
Got it. And yeah, thank you. That helps with the clarification. Thank you.
That's all I got.
Yeah, Matt, you didn't have anything in there as far as a new proposed table.
No, there's
No, that's correct. Yeah, I didn't want to start recommending anything again. I think that deserves a discussion. I mean, I can offer recommendations, but again, I don't want to propose something that doesn't fit Minturn. So I think there's more discussion that's needed there.
So I would like to propose that we think about January 10th. That'll be our next meeting.
January 10th is our next.
And I had at the beginning of this meeting written down January 10th being the time that we would have a better discussion about traditional versus form-based versus hybrid. We've already had some really good discussion. I'm getting a sense that we kind of feel, or at least there's people leaning a certain way. I still think it would be helpful to really dive a little deeper into that and understand maybe some examples of a form-based code versus a hybrid code and really be clear on what our feelings are on that. That's one decision point that we need to make as a recommending body. The next one would be maybe at the same meeting, but maybe not. Getting into the zone districts, the recommended zone districts coming out of the community plan, and having that discussion. Those to me are, and I think Matt touched on this, weigh in anytime, Matt, but those are a couple of the key areas that we need to make some decisions early on so we know how the rest of this is going to go. And, processes, existing versus future, who decides what, roles of approval. I think those will be further down the line, and maybe a little easier to get our head wrapped around than zone districts. That's going to be a very, time-consuming, robust discussion over multiple meetings, probably.
When you say weighing into the zone districts, you're talking about the segue of post-hybrid discussion, how that is then translated into the zone district above and beyond what's already listed here for the community plan?
Yep.
Okay.
Yeah, and revisiting the recommendations from the community plan. I think we said it in itself. We said it while the plan was being adopted. For people like Michael and probably other people that are concerned about what they might end up with as far as zone districts for their neighborhood. Those are recommendations. Now we're the hard work begins on the particulars of that. Everything from the allowable uses. If we take a different approach to allowable uses and it's more general and it's this hybrid thing, that could make some of those discussions a little easier, right? And it might make us look differently at differentiating between MU 1, 2, and 3, R1 and 2. So those were the thinking at that time. And I think those were good recommendations based on our direction to SE group to say, hey, we've got all these character areas and all these zone districts. That was their recommendation on how to streamline those down and simplify them, which, a lot of that might still carry forward. But hopefully you get my point. I think, that we need to first figure out what the form of this code is going to be and then start getting into the zone districts.
I appreciate that. I just wanted to make sure, like Jeff had mentioned, like we had all talked about before, that prior to being a hard copy presented in front of us, that, in certain aspects of this, like what you're saying, that we're still gonna, involve like certain neighborhoods, it's certain meetings to be invited in to comment.
Yeah, and we
Because
need to
that's
think
what
about
we-
that too.
Versus, because that's what we said we were gonna do, and I just don't want to see it get expedited past that.
I hear you. And that was the last thing I was going to say is we need to think about the public process now and how we either take our conversation to the neighborhoods or to people, or make sure there's ample opportunities for them to attend these meetings. So,
Just notify them.
Well, like you said, Scott, I mean, the making the choice to be more general
Mhm.
versus the 5 pages of uses. That's a big decision.
Yep.
It's a huge decision.
and our town attorney probably has some very strong thoughts on that.
I'm sure that they do, but, that, like you said, that's right at the top. Like, we gotta make that choice. And then the ship has to sail.
Yep.
And once the ship sails, we're going all the way down that road. And to go backwards after we've made that choice is a lot of work. Right? So we gotta make that right choice once. And if it, I'm not throwing anybody under the bus, but I know that there's some extenuating circumstances that are gonna take some time with our legal team to get things through. And that probably is gonna happen by the 10th.
No, and that's why I'm saying that we told you that we were gonna have a discussion about form-based versus traditional versus hybrid. We talked about it tonight. To me, that's a logical place to start back up again after the first of the year is let's get into the weeds on that and get some better information, have better discussion about it, and maybe make some decisions and be able to move forward, right? And then the next thing after that would be, and we certainly can make sure that Mike Sawyer, Richard, I know Michelle's meeting with a potential attorney that could step in and meant Mike and Richard's services. So we're not without an attorney to focus on these types of things. And this might be one of those areas where we're gonna ask that for that person to weigh in. So.
And I'll just add to that, Scott. As you mentioned, I think figuring out what type of code the community or the town wants is really important. First off, so we know how to structure this updated code. And then I think the zone district conversation. I wasn't involved, obviously, with the community plan, so I don't know what level of support there is for the recommendations that are included in the community plan. I will say, I guess one of my initial concerns looking at those recommendations versus the existing structure of the town zoning is I don't know that they take into consideration the character areas, and I could certainly be wrong about that. But the existing code, I mean, there was a reason those character areas were defined, and I think it's important to have a discussion about do those get carried over in some format, or are those completely abandoned? And do the recommended zone districts in the community plan are how do those kind of align or compare and contrast with the existing zone districts that are within the character areas? And are we, I mean, I think one of the critical things will be to ensure that the types of uses that are allowed in the existing zone districts, that we carry those forward as appropriate into whatever new zone districts are created, so that we're not taking away property rights from folks. And that's going to be some heavy lifting in my mind. So I think it's important to kind of roll up our sleeves in January and start getting into those discussions. And I think, as it relates to community engagement, having meetings with folks about the zone districts and what happens with those, whatever that looks like in the updated code, is going to be a really critical aspect of this code update.
Matt, I'll jump in just for some background. I was hired originally 7 years ago, specifically to come in and help undo the character areas and help rewrite the code. The town planner then left and I took over. We then took that up as a planning commission about a year later and spent a lot of time talking about uses and existing dimensional limitations, all that stuff. We went into the community plan with with a goal, quite frankly, of getting SE Group's recommendation on how to effectively eliminate the character areas, because we found that they were just confusing. There really wasn't that much differentiation from some aspects. What I've now heard in the last 4 or 5 months in our discussions here is that maybe we don't throw the baby out with the bathwater. Maybe there's something more akin to, neighborhood specific purpose and intent statements or something. I don't know where we're going with this, but it feels a little like we're coming full circle. And that's okay. I don't know that I have a strong opinion either way. All I know is that it's redundant and confusing the way it is now. So that's the history behind how SE Group got us to a recommended set of new zone districts to stop having all these different character areas that are confusing.
Right. Okay.
So
Well, and again, like whatever you call them, I mean, personally, I like the feel of a character area. I like the term better than an R1.
But there's
You know?
purpose statements underneath R1 that I think.
Well,
yeah.
yeah, but again, it's like call it whatever you want, put whatever label on it, what you want. What's important is the meat of what's behind it and what you're allowed to do in those areas, and making it very clear that, I guess, what I want to make sure of, and I think it's just organically going to happen when we specifically are going to talk about certain parts of town, like, again, what I said. And I kind of think of it in terms of the charrettes that were had, or the community engagement that was had. There were times when there was pushback from the community to say, there were some, I don't want to call them naysayers, but there were some people that were kind of negative with the data that came out of some of the process. And it was because of either a lack of engagement, a lack of numbers of people that actually, it's kind of like how many people come out and actually vote, right? The people that actually vote make the decisions. And there's tons of people in town, but only 5 people show up at a meeting and say something. Well, the same thing happens in charrettes. The same thing happens in some meetings where you've got very few people speaking out, and they're the ones who the data gets collected, processed, you have a report, and now, we're sitting on a new community plan. And there may be parts of the community plan, even though it's just a recommendation, there are maybe parts of it that certain members of the community don't appreciate or think is a great direction to go. And I think there's some, what I think is going to happen is, there's going to be people that come out and they say their 2 cents about their part of town that they live in. And like, to Scott's point, maybe we are coming full circle, but it's kind of like all the people from Denver deciding that we need to reintroduce wolves. And here they are
But it's not.
in Eagle County. They're not the ones that have to deal with it. So if there's a bunch of people that communicate, or, participated in certain data collection that gave opinions that were irrelevant to their part of town, but made a big impact on another part of town, I think that's going to organically work itself out.
I don't want to drag this out too much, but I will just remind everybody that you are right. There was probably less involvement than we would have liked, but we did get pretty good involvement. We had open houses. But we also had joint meetings between you and town council where we went through the whole thing and had, opportunities to say, I like it, I don't like it.
Yep.
We have an approved community plan, and we have at least some members of council that expect us to implement that plan. And when I say that, I mean implement those zone districts and move on with life. So
Totally.
and the other direction I've received from the mayor is, we don't need to relitigate this thing. We need to, do your job as a planning commission, as a planning staff, but let's get this done.
Okay.
Yeah, I totally agree. I don't want to waste our time fighting the community plan. I want to just let it be what it is.
Yeah.
And do our job.
And what I envisioned and what I think I, promised you all was that when we get into what really is an MU1. Because at the time I was like, we don't really know what's the difference is going to be in the list of allowed uses between MU1, 2, and 3. Now's our chance to get into that. And now's our chance to dive a little bit deeper and give another opportunity or several opportunities for people that will be impacted by any change that we make to a zone district to understand that. Here's what you have now. Here's what we're proposing. You're going to be same thing, less 3 potential uses. I'm just theorizing, right? That's where we're heading. And that's what we need to be really clear in communicating to people and make it understandable so they understand what rights are either being taken away or changing or whatever it is, right? And quite frankly, to decide if it really is MU1, 2, and 3. Now we're doing some hard work. I just don't see us straying that far from that. And if there's a way to blend what we like about character areas with some new zone districts and make it holistic and not lose what the work that was already done and what does make some of these character areas different, then let's figure out a way to do that.
Yeah.
Well, and keeping our eye on the bigger picture too, which is that lately right or wrong, I just kind of have been driving into town sometimes and just thinking about like driving from one end of town to the other end of town. It's like, and to think about all these names and districts and this and that, we're just one little town. And really like we should be more of a cohesive town that has a lot of connection, versus like, you can only do this in this part of town and only do this.
Awesome. Let's just do a town with one zone district.
Well, I'm not, yeah, I mean, I'm just kind of saying like,
Sounds good.
50-foot structure covers all.
Only in front of the midterm town.
Jeff, you're a vision.
Bring it.
Talk about.
just so sometimes I think about, gosh, like you get so into the weeds of like, where's the break?
Go and over engineer the solution is what you're saying?
No, till the rock comes down.
All right.
All right.
They fix the wall.
Matt, anything else?
Sort of.
Not that I can think of. I mean, one last thought on the zone district conversation, not to prolong this discussion, but I know we planners like these really wonky acronyms for zone districts like M1-9, 4, 5, A, B, C. I've tried on other other codes I've worked on to try and have the zone district be sort of an intent statement in itself. Like, is this zone district single family homes? Is it for a mix of homes? So that could be another way to kind of, again, incorporate some of these character area intents into the description or the name of the zone district rather than R1. I mean, what does R1 mean? Maybe that's a single family home district if that's kind of what the overall intent of that zone district is. So I think that's something to think about too, is having zone district designations that are a little more intuitive rather than some crazy acronym.
May I make a
Great
a
suggestion.
comment to that? I think that personalizes it to the people of that neighborhood, where R1 just makes them feel like, well, I'm an R1.
Yeah.
I think that personalizes it a little. It might make it a little more, they might come up with more concerns, and they might show up or something like that.
I like Old Town.
Yeah, and
I was
Gate
about to
Creek and
say.
Southtown and yeah.
Why not put out a survey for
Nice
people to
warm,
rename
fuzzy
their
name
name?
on the top, and then underneath it is an acronyms.
Warm fuzzy, there you go.
Refer to page 5.
Also known as.
Well, if Jeff wants it more homey, why not put out a survey and people can rename their neighborhoods?
Sounds like.
Oh, that would be interesting.
Okay.
So
Nope.
January 10th, should Matt and I start putting our heads together about bringing at least that discussion back,
Do
maybe
we have
some,
anything else on the agenda?
I don't know.
I think we start with that idea. If nothing else shows up on the agenda, then maybe we can add one more thing.
I'm really committed because, we should be, and you want to be committed to continuing to
Please.
chip away at this. And Matt, you did say that you're going to be out of country in February.
Yes, that's correct.
Sorry to put you on the spot, but we need to anticipate that.
For the whole month? So should we try
Pretty
to get
much.
2 meetings on this in January?
I think so.
So
if
review
possible.
form, you're gonna still bring that and then also start with the
Zoning.
Yeah.
Perfect.
Okay.
Okay.
All right. Next.
Thank you, Matt.
Thanks, Matt.
Thank you all. I appreciate your time.
Scott, can I ask one more thing, like, as an expectation for all of us, when we go on the 10th? Don't you think that, to your point of, like, what we said, we're gonna end up applying whatever form we end up with, whether it's traditional, hybrid, whatever, it's gonna get applied as a blanket to everything.
Yeah.
So once we start down that road, don't you feel like there's gonna be a lot of, we're gonna kind of like, let's say on the 10th, start really hammering out the what it's gonna look like from a well, just from a format standpoint, and a lot of it's gonna get cut and pasted. As like, you start with the intent, you start with this, you start with that, and then you end up with these statements about lot coverages and setbacks and this and that, and then there's some diagrams that refer to this and that, and a lot of that is gonna get cut and pasted to all districts. So that every district is gonna kind of start the same way, right?
It should, yeah, the format should be the same for each district or whatever we decide on. But are you saying, in addition to bringing some examples of a form-based code and a hybrid code from some other jurisdiction?
Oh, God.
I just think that that's gonna confuse everybody. I feel
Well,
like we're gonna naturally get to that point because we're gonna kind of discuss something and go, well, we don't have a diagram for this or a pretty picture for this. And this is what most people do, is they have a picture that describes the intent, and there it is.
What I'm saying is, on the 10th, Matt and I will bring examples of a form-based code that's used in some other town. So you can see this is a form-based code. Give you examples of this is what we're talking about. And this is what we're talking about when we say hybrid. So we're all on the same page of
Okay.
what the.
And then will you
are.
bring an example of traditional too?
And tradition, well, we have one, it's
That's
our
what
own
ours is.
code, but,
Yeah,
but
if it's simpler than looking at the whole thing.
are are you saying that we should then also at the same meeting?
Have a template, like the Minturn template.
Yes,
Yes, exactly.
yeah, here's what, if you combine those two, here's what it might look like
For
for
Minturn,
Minturn,
and let us
yeah.
start.
Like one zone.
Yeah, I mean, I would think you two have an idea kind of what it's gonna look like.
I do,
So let's let the cat out.
Yeah, let's
There you
let that
go.
cat out.
Let's break it out.
Let's do it.
Okay.
Even if it's just the tip of the iceberg.
we will do our best.
So the first meeting will be January 10th. The second meeting will be January 24th. Does anybody have any problems with any of that?
No,
Nay?
Not yet.
So we're good for the month of January.
Any end of year wish list kind of stuff for 2024? Other than getting this code done?
New Year's resolution kind of stuff?
Oh, yeah, you're really asking that question.
Oh. I don't know.
If we get the
Any-
code
any-
done, I think 2024 is a lock. We're done. Call it a day.
Like,
Are we,
We need to get the
did you
code done.
find anything else on the menu?
Tell the mic.
The what?
Much working on a new ordinance to adjust.
No, as Jeff alluded to, we really don't have great resources right now at the town attorney's office. We have great resources. We just don't really have access to them because they're too busy or dealing with other stuff.
I mean, yeah, keep Mike in your prayers, because he's
Yeah.
he's fighting.
That's a
He's
more
in the-
eloquent way to put it. I will try to bring that back because it really is not that big of a deal. I think the one thing I wanted to do was reach out to Eagle County Housing Department just to make sure they thought our 200% AMI down to 140 is the right target. So I can try to bring that back for,
Well, you just mentioned it and we haven't heard any more, so I thought
yeah,
I'd
thanks
ask.
for bringing that up. Yep.
I mean, just as a point, this is not to get off topic, but like. I made a call to those apartments that are next to Walmart,
Mhm,
the new ones.
mhm.
Piedmont,
You know what a two-bedroom apartment goes for in there?
$4,000.
2,500.
$4,000 a month.
They just jacked the rents 80% on the people that were there.
$4,000 a month.
Yeah.
For a two-bedroom.
Yeah.
I don't know.
Wait, when did they change that?
What are they building next to it? Another one?
And there's a wait list.
I just saw all those modulars just sitting down at the end if they're going through some different style of.
Well, the two apartments upstairs of the bunkhouse went up like 80%. One group moved out and the other stayed for a while, but I think they've changed out too now. You know, when you talk about having living quarters for
Good point.
employee housing in downtown Minturn, it isn't gonna happen unless they get a group of 6 people in there to do that for $4,000 a month.
But like to your point, Scott, we haven't heard from Tori or any of those gals in a long time.
Nope. I'm not too happy with our relationship right now.
They're not?
I'm not.
Well,
I asked Kim three times over 4 months to opine on Minturn North's housing plan and got nowhere.
got nothing?
No, and now we have a approved plan and an approved housing plan that the county supposedly is supposed to be helping us administer, like deciding who's eligible to be a local and who's not and all that stuff. So I think Michelle needs to have a conversation with the county on that. Because we have an intergovernmental agreement with them. They're supposed to be helping us and weighing in on things like Minturn North and
And you don't know why?
what?
You don't know why? They're just
No.
so MIA?
I don't know why.
Busy
I
down
know
there.
they're busy too, but I
Feels
don't
like
think
that.
that's a good excuse. We're relying on them to help us because they have the expertise to do it. So
And they're funded by the county?
they are the county.
They are, yeah.
They're county employees. It's a county department.
Both Kim and Tori?
Yeah, it's, and it's traffic.
Interesting.
Yep.
Shit.
Have you bet Matt Scherzier?
I'm not.
No, I didn't want to throw people under the bus. I'd rather have a conversation with them first. And
All right.
Let's do it.
thank you all for a great.
Okay, what's next on the agenda?
Motion to
Merry
dismiss.
Christmas.
Motion to adjourn.
Christmas. Happy New Year. We will see you all in the new year.
Absolutely.
27th, right? Okay.
Uh,
So who
okay.
makes the motion?
I make a motion to have a Merry Christmas and adjourn this meeting.
I have a second. Motion by Tom, second by Jeff. All in
Aye.
favor? Aye.
Oh,
Thank you, Madison. Thanks, Scott.
so Jeff,
For your service this year.